A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. Hello everybody. Today what I thought I'd do on the channel is group together 10 tips or concepts or observations that I've been talking about on this channel for the past few years, I suppose, into one video in the hope that that's useful. Also, the weather is rubbish at the moment. It's just high grey blanket cloud, which I don't mind shooting in from time to time, but it's all there has been recently, so I'm sick of it. Anyway, tip number one, I don't know if it's really a tip, more of an observation, but learning to shoot quickly has been of huge benefit to my photography. Now, often, as you'll know, if you're an experienced photographer, we are afforded time when we're taking photos in the outdoors. Maybe we want to take a shot of a mountain, and it might be the case, if we're lucky, that the conditions of that mountain won't change for, I don't know, half an hour. And if that's the case, we can take our time with things like composition, choosing the lens that we want to use, deciding if we want to use filters, for example, or a tripod, But yeah, our decision making can be quite kind of leisurely and methodical. Other times, however, we don't get that. Things can happen in a split second. And sometimes, what have I just done? Sometimes the best stuff happens within the blink of an eye. And if we practice getting good at taking photos under those conditions, then we can get some of our favorite shots, I think. Now, there are two things that I try and do to make sure that I'm in the best possible place to try and get photos when the opportunities arise very quickly. Number one is I shoot with a Peak Design capture clip that I've spoken about so many times on this channel. Fantastic piece of kit. Failing that, I just use a camera strap. Basically, I make sure that if I'm outside, my camera is outside. In other words, I don't put my camera in my camera bag unless I'm back at the car or at the hotel or at home. My camera lives outside when I'm outside. Second thing I do is that when my camera is outside but I'm not actively shooting with it, so I might be hiking and it might just be resting in my capture clip, I will set my lens to something sensible like f8, which means that if an opportunity arises, I'm in a position to get a shot with a sensible aperture, basically. Meaning I'm going to have lots of the scene in focus and the lens is going to be performing well optically. Sorry, I keep just knocking my computer with my elbow and it's distracting me. Second thing I do on my camera is I'll select a minimum shutter speed that's appropriate for the conditions. So for example, if I'm shooting at 35mm, I'll often set a minimum shutter speed of 50th of a second, something like that. And that means between my sensible aperture and my sensible shutter speed, I'm in a position to get a sensible shot without having to do anything to the camera because my auto ISO will take care of the exposure. So yes, if an opportunity arises from there, my camera isn't going to get in the way of me getting a shot. And some of my favorite photos have come from seeing an opportunity in a split second and being able to take a photo within that split second. Split second might be an exaggeration, to be honest. It's 5-10 seconds maybe. But I've not had to faff around with settings to get there. Tip thing number two is observation, which I spoke about pretty much exclusively in my last video. So why am I talking about it again? Well, in that last video, I was talking about observation as the most important skill a photographer can have. You can only take the photos that you see, and therefore improving or extending the amount of stuff that you see is vital to capturing good photos. And in essence, it's a practice of mindfulness, really. But the reason that I bring it up today is because I didn't really talk in that video about when I'm most susceptible to not being mindful, and that is when I'm going somewhere with a specific shot in mind. I'm en route, either on foot, on my bike, or in the car, to somewhere very specific for a very specific shot, because in those instances my mind is kind of laser focused on that individual image, and what that means is that I miss the opportunities that I see or don't see en route. And often if you're on the way to somewhere epic to take an epic photo, chances are that there are other places on the way to that location that would also give you opportunities for photos, and quite often I kind of shut myself off from that, which is a bad thing. Thing number three, gear matters. Gear really does matter in photography, just an awful lot less than we think or that marketers would have us believe. Now again, I've spoken about this quite recently. I made a video in Italy a few months ago with this camera. This is a Lumix GX1, it cost me £50. And I've spoken about comparing images from this camera and this camera, which is my Sony A7R Mark IV. Now the used price difference between these two cameras is about 40 times, i.e. this cost 40 times what this costs. And this is a better camera by any technical measure than this camera. The question is, does it matter? And my answer to that is it depends. Obviously, we always want to use the best tools that we can for the job. The trouble with doing that is that often our camera budget comes out of our photography budget, as you might expect. And too often I see people spending way too much money on their camera, meaning that they don't have enough money to take photos, to go on trips, to take time off work, to give themselves chances at getting photos. They've got this fantastic camera, but no means to use it. And we have to remember that the only purpose that these things serve is to take photos. It's pretty obvious really, but yeah, I say all this to say that while the price difference between these two cameras is 40x, the quality difference is nowhere near 40x. You'll struggle to see the difference between these two cameras unless you are pixel peeping, I would say. And keeping that in mind every time a new camera comes out is really important. Elephant in the room, I'm clearly shooting with professional gear. You might ask why, given what I've just said. And the answer is because I want to the detriment of savings, basically. Very similar to the last tip, it's about gear again. Buy the camera you'll use, not the camera you want. And what I mean by that is that I suspect there are many, many Leicas in this world that live in the box that they came in, that live in the house of their owner. And all too often I see photographers being worried about going out in the rain or the snow or the sand or the wind, whatever it might be, because they're concerned for their camera. Now, to some extent, that is completely legitimate. Obviously, these are expensive bits of kit, whatever camera you have, and you do want to take care of it. However, as I said, the only thing in the world that this can do is take photos. And we want to make sure that we buy a camera that we're willing to take photos with. And ultimately, if we buy a camera that we can't afford to replace or that we can't afford to insure, and therefore we never really take photos of it in conditions that could yield fantastic photos, then as far as I'm concerned, it has not been a good purchase. And your decisions begin to be controlled by your equipment rather than you controlling your equipment, which is obviously the way around that it should be. So yes, gear is fantastic. It's brilliantly fun to get excited about it, but don't do so to the detriment of being able to take photos, which is easier said than done. But yeah, get insurance or just buy cameras that you can afford to replace. And that doesn't mean that we need to go around throwing our cameras about, but it does mean that if there's a storm that might be fantastic to photograph, we shouldn't be terrified of going out with that camera and damaging it, because the only reason that camera should exist in our lives is for moments like that. I'll try and speed this up. Shoot for the edit. Now, lots of people don't like to edit photos. I completely get that. They like to do everything in camera. That, for those people, is photography. For me, editing is a huge part of photography. It's a hugely enjoyable part of photography, and I love it. And therefore, it's important that I shoot for the edit. Now, historically, what that might have meant is exposing very carefully to make sure that you didn't have to adjust the exposure too much in the edit. I don't worry about that kind of stuff too much now because dynamic range in modern cameras is fantastic. You can adjust the exposure without worrying too much about things like noise. But what you can't do is make a photo wider than you shot it. And in an age where we like to post things on various social media platforms and all sorts of stuff online, many of us like to print, it's important that we give ourselves a bit of leeway when it comes to changing aspect ratios. So practically speaking, what I like to do is to try and shoot 3 to 5 millimeters wider than what I think is the optimal composition. Now, that is aided by the fact that I shoot with a 61 megapixel camera, but to be honest, even if you're shooting with a camera that has a much more sensible megapixel count, I think it's well worth giving up the resolution for the flexibility of having shot a little bit wider than what you think is optimal for the final composition. Number 7, that's entirely a guess. Count your progression in time out with a camera rather than time. Now, if you've spent any time on photography forums, you'll know that they can be very helpful places or quite intimidating places. And you'll often come across people who proclaim to have shot for the last 40 or 50 years and hail themselves as the most experienced photographers in the world. And that may very well be the case. But often you'll find that people have shot for decades and decades, but at an average of once per month. Whereas another person might have only shot for 5 years, but they've done so 3 or 4 times a week. Now, the second person in that scenario is more experienced. They've had more time out shooting with a camera, but they don't necessarily feel like that when they're talking to someone who has decades of supposed experience. Now, the reason I say this is that I have often in the past ended up feeling like I have nothing to add to a conversation about photography when I'm speaking to people who in years have been taking photos for a lot longer than I have. But it's important to recognise that you do have something to add to those conversations often, even if you spent significantly less time in years taking photos, because you might have spent more time in hours with a... I don't know how to say that, but hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. Number 8, I think, anticipation, which is kind of similar to observation and being able to take photos quickly. But observation and the ability to take photos quickly is greatly helped by the ability to anticipate what's going to happen. Whether it be a light change because a cloud is moving over, whether it be a car coming down the road. I mean, you know what anticipation is. Basically being able to see something before it happens by 5, 10 seconds or minutes. And practicing that opened the door for me to take so many more photos that I was proud of. And it does take practice. It does take spinning your head around a location constantly, but it's a worthwhile endeavour. Finding joy in the process is crucial, I think, to become a better photographer, because if you don't, I don't think you'll be taking photos for very long. You might have noticed, if you've been a photographer for a long time, you don't always get a photo that you want every time you go out with your camera. In fact, you might only get a photo that you want every 7, 8, 9, 10 times you go out with a camera. And finding a way to enjoy the times that you don't get photos that you like, that is crucial to making sure you go out the next time in the hope of, well, another opportunity. And so for me, I'm quite lucky. I enjoy the outdoors, but I also enjoy listening to podcasts in the outdoors. And so I've added that to my regime of taking photos. Even though you could argue it does distract me a bit from being able to observe and anticipate. I don't find it too bad, but yeah, other people might not like that. There is one commonality between all my favourite photos that I've ever taken and all the favourite photos of other photographers that I've ever seen, and that is they all made me say, I wonder. I wonder how long that's been there. I wonder what it's doing there. I wonder what it looks like in these conditions. I wonder what the story is. I wonder how long that light lasted. I wonder. Now, there's nothing wrong with pretty photos, they're fantastic, but photos that pull you in, photos that genuinely pique your curiosity, you'll keep going back to those constantly. At least I do, and I've found that that is the common denominator between all photos that I like. They make me say, I wonder. But if you can work out what you're curious about, or if you can see what you're curious about and take photos of those things, that is a surefire way to finding your own style and your own voice with a camera in hand. And finally, my philosophy in photography, as I've talked about countless times on this channel, is very simple, and it's to simplify. Now, it's my belief that in order to pull people into photos, in order to interest them in photos, we can't make them work for it. Because as soon as a viewer of a photo has to work out what the subject is, has to work out what they're supposed to be looking at, there's a chance we might lose them. And so I think it's our job as photographers to use focal lengths or exposure or depth of field or shutter speeds, whatever it might be, all the tools at our disposal to simplify an image as much as possible. And as soon as I've seen something that makes me curious, that makes me say, I wonder, I then try and work out how I can represent this thing as simply as possible. And I'm not saying that's the right way to do things, I've just found that that's a very effective way to communicate my message. My message, that sounds so ridiculous. I found it's the best way to take photos, to simplify things that make me curious. Anyway, yeah, there's 10 things to hopefully think about. I don't know if that was interesting or not. fingers crossed. What I do think is interesting though is the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. And I've been sent lots of messages recently asking the template that I use on Squarespace, and it's Wells. There are many different fantastic templates for photography websites on Squarespace, but I've used Wells for probably the last 5 years, I'd say, something like that, 5 or 6 years, and I love it. I really like how the portfolio page works. I think it organizes images really nicely. I love the online store functionality. I love the simplicity of the standalone pages. I think it's brilliant. And if you'd like a Squarespace website of your own, you can check it out for free by going to squarespace.com. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off that first purchase. Also, newsletters. I've said this a million times before, but I'm going to try, I promise, to do a newsletter every month from now on. Again, I've said this so many times before, but I'm really going to try from now on because I really want to get in the habit of doing it. I think it's a brilliant thing to do. And I've got no excuse. They're so easy to pull together on Squarespace. So yes, I will endeavour to do that. So if you'd like to sign up on my website, that'd be great. And you also get a free preset for doing so. Right, next week, hopefully we'll be back outside, and please subscribe if you haven't already in the meantime, but I'll see you then. Cheers.